Cool. Hi everyone, my name is Zhang, and I'm going to be giving a talk about the beginner's guide to growth engineering. So thank you all for coming to my talk. So what exactly are we going to cover in this talk? Well, the first basic question is, what is growth engineering? Then we're going to dive into a case study about a sample app called Corey. We'll talk about what's next, and finally we'll end with a Q&A if time permits. Before we dive in, a little bit about myself. Again, like I said, my name is John. I'm currently a software engineer at Meta, formerly known as Facebook. I've been there for just over 5 years now, and I've worked on growth teams my whole time over there. Originally, I started off in Menlo Park, which is the headquarters, and then I moved over to New York City, which is where I live now. Over the past week, I was able to travel around Japan, and I had a great time. Here's me with the deer at Nara Park. But that's enough about myself. Let's dive into the topic. So, question for the audience: what is the most important step in growing your product? Any ideas? Feel free to shout it out. Money, I think I heard someone say. That is a good answer. You definitely do need money when growing your product. But today's talk is not really focused about money. Is the registration flow. So what do all of those apps behind me have in common? They all have a registration flow. So no matter if you are a video game developer, you're trying to start a photo sharing blog, or you're trying to set up just something that you and your friends can split expenses on, almost every single website or product today has accounts. And as part of that process, you have the registration flow. So with that answer, let's dive into our first topic: what exactly is growth engineering? Simply put, it is the art of optimizing your product to maximize growth. Now, growth happens in a funnel of 4 steps. The first is awareness, then acquisition, then activation, and lastly, retention. In our talk today, we're mainly going to focus on 2 things: acquisition and activation. So what exactly is acquisition? Well, say that you actually build out an app. How do you get people to start using it? That's one of the fundamental questions that people have. Is it something you download from the App Store, from the Play Store? Do you put out ads on Instagram so that people know about it? Do you have word of mouth traveling around? How do we actually acquire our users? This falls into the acquisition bucket. You'll oftentimes see today, if you go onto any website, say TikTok, Reddit, you'll have options like sign in with Apple, sign in with Google, or sign in with Facebook. Now, why is that? Have you really thought about that? It's because creating an account is actually a really tedious process. You have to create a password, input your birthday, input your contact information. No one actually likes to do that. And as a result, sign-up flows are often neglected by developers as well. All too often, developers will plug in some OAuth, some SSO, and then just forget about the sign-up flow and never think more about it. But actually, that is the key to acquisition. On the other hand, we have activation, which happens after registration, and it involves logging in. It's actually one of the biggest drop-off points for users. And if this isn't something that you've been thinking about, it should be. Is your login service confusing to users? Do users forget their password? The answer is yes, they always do. And if they do, how exactly do they access their account once more? All of these fall under the activation category of growth engineering. So with those 2 definitions defined, let's dive into our sample case study with an app called Corey. So meet Corey. It is a simple social media app for users to share their thoughts. We're going to be using Corey's registration flow as a case study for some of the growth engineering principles that I'm going to be going over today. So let's take a look at the Corey growth funnel. Every single flow inside your app, whether it's a checkout flow, whether it's a user activation flow, or in this case, a registration flow, should have a user funnel. And data is everything. Let me repeat that. Data is everything. It's the key to understanding the user story behind how people are using your product. With the data at hand, you should be able to reconstruct exactly what a user is doing based off of the funnel data. On the right-hand side here, we have the different steps of the registration flow. The first one, you fill in your name, your contact point, your birthday, and your password. Everyone's seen that before. And then on the right-hand side of that, we have how many users are actually hitting each of those steps. And so if you notice, there is a very, very large drop-off of almost 50% between the name and the contact point step. despite those two steps being right next to each other, why is there such a big drop-off? Well, let's take a look at the name step funnel here. So diving a little bit deeper, we see about 16 million users actually view the name step. But of those 16 million users, only 8.8 million of them tap continue. And then even less focus on the form, which means they interact with the form, 7.3. And at the end of the funnel, we have only 6 million users who are actually filling in their name. So even just looking at this, we see that the largest drop-off is between the people who view your form and people who actually click the continue button. So let's brainstorm some ideas for how we can fix this. Should we have flashy graphics pointing to the name box? Should we have pre-filled names? Any other ideas for how we can fix this drop-off?
No name.
No name. That's actually a good idea, but unfortunately in the case of Corey, because it's a social media app, we do require names. But that is a very good point in that if there are certain fields that are optional or not required, for example, maybe you don't need the username for the user or you can automatically generate one, having certain steps be skippable or optional is one way to increase the funnel. So what we actually ended up doing is auto-focusing inputs. So for you and me, we're very familiar with the internet. We're very familiar with how text box worked. But if you're trying to launch an app or sell a service that is growing international, you have to keep all sorts of users in mind, and that includes those who are new to the internet. So users in developing countries such as Africa or India, they might not actually know that they have to tap a text box in order to start typing. So for you and me, this seems really intuitive and second nature, but you have to keep in mind, these are people who have never used the internet before. And so a really simple fix here is if we can open up the screens with the keyboard already up, users have an easier time in registering. Another really easy fix that we implemented was that originally we had server-side validation for names. This was to check for illegal names, invalid names, etc. But what we did is actually, we all work in JavaScript here, we can add client-side validation for some of the more easy things, like empty string validation. And this provides fast feedback, because if you were doing a server round trip, especially in those areas I mentioned earlier, such as Africa, India, or some of the largest growth areas in tech right now, the internet speed is quite slow, and so you're going to end up with a user who tries to tap continue, and there's a very long latency between the server round trip and when the user receives feedback. So with these two improvements in place, we actually were able to increase name acquisition by an entire 8%, which you might be saying, hey John, 8%, that seems really small. But the thing to keep in mind is that this is the very, very top of your funnel. So 8% actually translates all the way through into 8% more users using your app, 8% more revenue, 8% more users engaging with your app, posting stories, and whatnot. So a small change at the top of your funnel has a cascading waterfall effect that affects every single subsequent metric, including money, as we all love. All right, so now that we've gone through a simple example, let's go over something called the Understand, Identify, and Execute framework. This was first popularized at Facebook many years ago, and it's a framework that a lot of growth teams use to identify projects and identify where opportunities are. So there are 3 steps: understanding the problem space, identifying the levers to achieve your goal, and then executing on those levers perfectly. All right, so coming back to Corey, let's take a deeper dive into the birthday step. Why do people have trouble with this step? Why do people not input their birthdays? To you and me, this seems like a really, really simple step. Again, it's not something we spend a lot of time on. It's not something that we think a lot about. So for the first step of the UIE framework is understand. And really what that boils down to is asking yourself, what information do we know? And of that, there is quantitative data and qualitative data. So quantitative data is kind of like what we looked at earlier. It's hard numbers. It's the logs that you added in your code to see how are users interacting with your app. It's analysis and modeling. Where on the other hand, qualitative data is based off of user research and interviews. So this involves if you have a forum that people discuss your app on, if you have a Discord, asking friends and family for feedback, bug reports, basically anything that is non-numerically related. So this is the first step, is understanding the problem, and it is the most important step in this whole process because it drives the direction of your entire project. So coming back to our birthday example, we had user researchers go out to India, to Africa, to actually understand better why people are having trouble with the birthday step. What they found is that birthday selection has proven difficult for participants in a number of cases and with different birthday selector designs. In addition to UI challenges, they found that some cultures didn't even have the concept of a birthday, which again, to you and I might seem surprising, but in certain more remote parts of Africa, birthday is not actually something that is recorded. One data collector even explained that they needed to bring a tablet and logbook to help some individuals approximate their date of birth. They said, I would have to look up events they associate their birthday with, like when the railway reached Nairobi. So what have we found? There are two issues that are challenging for users right now. One is that users are not familiar with how dropdowns work. If you thought that text boxes were difficult, if you bring dropdowns to people who are new to the internet, they have no idea what to do. Secondly, it's a cultural aspect in which some people don't even have birthdays. So these are things that we found with qualitative research. Coming to the quantitative side, we can actually look here, it's kind of small, but you can see this is the percentage of users who signed up for an account without ever changing their birthday. So the default birthday is today's date, and these are the percentages of users who've never changed that from today's date. And so you can see in places like India and Myanmar, it's 40% of users don't ever interact with the birthday selector when signing up for their accounts. In more developed areas, such as the United States, only 10% of users do that. Taking a look at the logging data we have, we ask ourselves the questions, what were people actually doing on the birthday step? What does the data show us? What is the user journey here? Do users actually interact with the dropdowns before tapping continue, and exactly how often are they tapping continue? So what we see here is that a lot of users actually are tapping continue. In fact, many more users are tapping continue than those who are actually interacting with the dropdowns themselves. So with all of that information, let's move on to the second step, which is identifying. How can we fix the problem that we've just identified? So with this step, you want to see which pieces of data from the understand portions are most promising. And again, we've identified that, okay, a lot of users are spam clicking the continue button. They're not able to continue onwards because it's an invalid birthday. And we want to ideate on what ideas we can pursue to solve the problem. Lastly, you want to rate the ideas based on how impactful they will be. And it's also sometimes useful to take wild shots that are completely different from all the other ideas you've had, just to test out something new. So for our specific scenario, we came up with 4 different designs. We met with our design team as well as research team, and we came up with something known as age bucketing. So we took the idea of using buttons. This is something that everyone is familiar with. Users in the registration flow, in order to get to the birthday portion, which is step 3, already had to be tapping buttons. So we figured this is a UI element that they would be familiar with. Likewise, we bucketed the ages, and we said that, hey, based off of user research, we know that people know how old they are. They might not know what their birthday is, but the main thing for us is that we want to make sure that people are over 13 when signing up for a social media app. And so that was the prevailing idea behind these first 2 designs. The third design took it one step even further and simplified it down to a simple, are you under 13 or are you over 13? So really getting to that extreme level. And I'm sure many of you have seen that kind of notice, specifically when visiting certain sites on the internet. The last one is a little bit more of that moonshot that we just talked about, which deviates completely from this button idea, and instead reverts back to something that was seen earlier in the name step, which is just a text box asking users how old they are. This brings us to our third step, which is execute. The most straightforward step, but oftentimes the most neglected one, which is building out the solution. So you build the solutions you identified in the previous step, and this is where your ideas really come to life. But executing correctly is very important. All too often, teams will actually fail at this step. They'll have buggy implementations, and then they'll chalk it up to their ideas or hypotheses were incorrect. Or they'll spend time just rushing it out as quickly as possible in order to meet a deadline. And as a result, the quality is not quite as high as it should be, and that invalidates all of the work they did previously. So executing, while it may seem straightforward in that you don't have to do much brainstorming or thinking, it is an extremely important step to get correctly. So we're going to talk about something called A/B testing, which is a method that a lot of large companies use to determine which treatment is best for a user. In this case, it's more like an ABCD test, but basically what it boils down to is that we show certain segments of users different treatments. So in this case, maybe 25% of users will see the first treatment, 25% of users will see the second treatment, 25% see the third, and so on. In this way, we can directly compare each treatment with another treatment and see what the completion rates of each one are, telling us which design is the most effective. Before I reveal this, does anyone have any idea which design performs best? Option B. Okay, this one. Anyone else? You don't know? Well, that's why I'm here and that's why I'm giving this talk. But what we actually saw is that option A and B were not performing that well. Now, why is that? Let's take a deeper look into what actually is happening here. If a user says they're under 13, we are legally obliged to block them from using the app because that is the minimum age required. Now, if you think again back to people who are completely new to the internet, what's something that they do a lot? They just spam click through all of the terms and services and they'll spam click through registration as well. I've done it, you've done it, we've all done it at some point. And in this case, there's actually, if you leave it completely up to chance and assume that a user is spam clicking, there's actually a 1/3 chance that they'll select an age bucket that is too young. And we further saw data supporting this because we saw the number of errors in which a user was too young for the app increase with both of these options. For that same reason, option 3 also performed very poorly because now you have a 50-50 chance of selecting an age that is too young. So it's actually our moonshot idea, this age text box, that ended up performing the best. Now again, let's think about why that is. Well, a text box is an element that users are already familiar with. They had to fill in their name, and because it's blank, users aren't able to skip the step by randomly clicking elsewhere. So they're forced to type in an age, and an age is something, once again, we saw from user research that a lot of users actually do know and are able to fill in. So we began with this age selector on the left, and we ended up with this age input on the right-hand side. So what does that look like altogether? For all users, we give them the default birthday step because, once again, we don't want to provide this age fallback to all users, only those who need it. For people like you and me, we can fill in our date of birth with no problem. We added logic that said if a user is stuck on this birthday step for 2 or more errors, meaning they try to click through and got that same error twice in a row, we actually replace the step using JavaScript with an age fallback, which gives the option to type in your age manually. So let's summarize what we just saw. Using the understand, identify, and execute framework, we analyze data and user research to understand some of the problems that users faced when completing the birthday step. We took that information and we identified potential solutions and came up with something called the age fallback solution. Lastly, we executed by building and testing multiple solutions, ultimately landing on a text box-based age input field. This change resulted in a 22% increase in the number of users who were able to complete the step. And once again, this is a 22% increase on your top line, which then trickles down to every single other metric that you care about in your app. Another common question is, what about design? How much does that actually matter? Well, people are naturally drawn to elements that are highlighted. So let's take a look at another example. Which one do you think resulted in more new accounts being created? Again, that's why I'm here, to tell you. The one on the left-hand side actually increased new account registration by 10%. So what I'm trying to say here is that small changes on high visibility surfaces may make a large impact. And this is something that's really, really easy to overlook, especially as engineers, where we're not essentially concerned that much about the design and the UI. These things might just go over our head, but such a small change like changing the button color, that takes less than a minute to implement from the engineering side. It can have a really, really large effect on the conversions of your apps. So then that begs the question, why not make everything green and flashy? Well, let's do one last case study. We had a lot of users report that their whole profile was missing. and that their account was completely gone when they tried to sign in again. What was the problem? People couldn't understand the difference between login and account creation. So people, instead of going into logging into their accounts, they would actually tap that create new account button because it was so visually appealing, and they would be entered into the create new account flow. They would think, oh, I just have to do this every single time I access the app, and they would be creating new accounts instead of logging into their existing ones. More accounts created, it's not always a good thing, right? Because we don't want existing users to be creating new accounts and again and again. So how did we solve this? Well, when people misclick the create new account button when they wanted to log in and vice versa, we actually just made a server call to say, hey, check if this user exists already based off of these credentials, and if they do, just log them in and show them the main feed rather than creating a new account. So coming back to the question, why not make everything green and flashy? Well, there are always trade-offs with what your users are doing. In this case, we were trading off successful logins, which is the activation pillar, for more account creations, which is the acquisition pillar. And in this case, that's a trade-off that we don't want to be making because we are hurting real users by having them create new accounts each and every time. So, what's next after all of this? You might be thinking, John, that talk was great, but my users are smart. They remember their passwords, they know their birthdays, so this information is not that helpful for me. Or I'm just trying to develop an app for Japan or an app for the US where users are tech savvy. So this isn't really applicable. Well, the key idea is still the same, and the key to everything is data. Invest resources into understanding the user journey that your users are going on. Add in logging. I can't stress that enough. You need the logging in your app in order to retell the story of what users are doing, what their pain points are, and where the latency happens. Like we did earlier, we identified outliers in the data, both on the birthday step and the name step, and we were able to come up with solutions that increased metrics by a lot. The other thing is that details matter. You may not be paying attention to the design of your app, the loading times, or the way you sequence your steps, but think about yourself as a user. When you encounter a long loading time, you're more likely to drop off. You're less likely to come back to that app because you know there is a long loading time. Again, add logging into your app so you can analyze that and see where are users dropping off. And with a large enough user base, it will become abundantly clear where those improvements can be made. We haven't even touched on retention yet, which basically talks about how do you actually keep users from coming back to your app after you acquire them. But that's a whole other talk, and tune in next year for that. So that is the end. Thank you for coming to my talk. We do have a couple minutes, I think, for Q&A, but otherwise, thank you so much.
So Q&A time. Do you have any questions, or is that okay? Or what it is a shy? Yeah, I guess this is really good. Yeah, so we maybe to focus on our user attention and the user thinking. That's so good. So yeah, in this conference, so that is a bit. So there are many types of technical talks, but this is not only technical talk. So that is okay. Yeah, I'm very appreciative about that. I'm very happy to see this session. Yeah. Okay, so it doesn't have questions. Okay. Okay. So thank you for that.